Trishana's current research project focuses on critical phenomenologies of aging with a specific focus on temporality. Her research on aging bridges work in phenomenology, philosophy of disability, aging studies, critical gerontology, social philosophy, and bioethics. And her talk, the title of her talk today is Running Out of Time, a critical phenomenology of the biological clock. Please join me in welcoming our speaker.
Thank you so much, Ron, and thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you to the department for the invitation to speak and to present this work on the biological clock. And really thank you all for being here as well, and for your attention and your time. This is newer work. I normally work, my dissertation is on later life and experiences of old age through the lens of temporality, and this talk is on the experience of age at a different time of life. So it's sort of my sort of first reflections and first thoughts on this particular topic. So I'm really excited to hear your reflections and your insights. It's a relatively short talk. It's about 35 minutes. So this talk provides a critical phenomenology of the biological clock through an analysis of the experience of running out of time. It proceeds by providing a very brief history of the reproductive metaphor of the biological clock. And then I draw on the method of critical phenomenology to bring to light what this experience is like, and suggest that when taken in its most general form, the experience of running out of time is marked by a relational and temporal disruption in the lived flow of experience that is prompted by an encounter with a deadline. By way of conclusion, I'll discuss the role that social life worlds play in shaping the experience of running out of time, asking in particular how pronatalism, which is a social prejudice that motherhood is good, and the organization of our shared social life worlds shape the experience of running out of time. So we can proceed to the next slide. So in its popular usage, the biological clock is a metaphor used to describe the experience of the pressure, burden, and risk women may feel at the peak of their reproductive years in the face of changes in procreative possibilities. Today, the metaphor is taken up in public discourse, and it's been written about by authors such as Sheila Heti in Motherhood, and Michelle T's recent work in Knocking Myself Up, which sort of gives a queer narrative of the biological clock. It's invoked by companies such as Apple and Google, who provide seductive benefit packages for new employees that include insurance coverage of egg freezing and IVF, which are very expensive, in the tens of thousands of dollars if you're paid out of pocket. But the ubiquity and the familiarity with which we speak and use the metaphor to give us pause. Biologists have deployed the term the biological clock as early as the 1950s to refer to the inborn mechanisms that regulate natural cyclical cycles of organisms over time, such as circadian rhythms, digestive cycles, and sexual cycles. But it was Richard Cohen, a writer for the Washington Post, who adapted the term to its popular cultural usage as a reproductive metaphor of declining fertility with age. The metaphor first appeared in the article "The Clock is Ticking for the Career Woman," published on March 16, 1978, which is also the same year that IVF, which in vitro fertilization, emerged as a medical technology to treat a very specific form of infertility, which is blocked fallopian tubes. The 1970s saw an en masse postponement of pregnancy and family formation by professional, educated, and typically white women in North America, and that was thanks largely due to increased access to contraception and increased educational and professional possibilities. And these changes to the structure of society changed reproductive patterns as well. Cohen's article opens, so this is the article, and I'll just give a very sort of short version of it. So Cohen's article opens with a description of what he calls the composite woman. She is between the ages of 27 and 35, and she appears to have it all. She has a job, she's well educated, and she may even be partnered, Cohen says. Though she appears to have it all, Cohen describes the ways in which some of his interviewees felt pressured and anxious about what he calls this business about the biological clock, and the need to make a decision between two seemingly competing and incompatible futures, a flourishing professional life, and the desire to form a family. Women are, in Cohen's view, largely passive to their fertility cycles, much in the same way he suggests that fickle weather makes farmers throw their hands up in impotent resignation. Quote, unfair, yes, but out of their control, an important word, end quote. So at play in Cohen's article are two interrelated, but conflated understandings of the biological clock. First, that the limits of fertility are rooted in the body, and here the biological clock is conceived through the lens of biological changes in fertility over time, that fertility naturally declines with age, and this fact is taken to necessarily affect a person's life. So I'm not going to get into the science of this because it's beyond the paper, but just as a general point, as everyone gets older, but especially women, and I'll just say I'm using the term women, but using that in a very sort of open way. A biological clock doesn't just pertain to women at that particular experience. But as women get older, fertility starts to decline, specifically women's eggs start to decline, and they decline precipitously by late 30s, and by sort of mid 40s, the ability to get pregnant without technological intervention, some kind of external intervention, becomes highly unlikely. So a lot of the sort of celebrities you see now who are getting pregnant at 47 and 50 are likely not using the eggs that they have in their body at that time, and likely using donor eggs or younger eggs, or eggs that they froze when they were younger. So second, there's this notion of the biological clock that refers to a particular prenatal experience of running out of time to make a decision in light of a formidable deadline or before the time runs out. So the experience of the biological clock should be seen as a prenatal experience. It's an experience before their pregnancy has happened, and it's distinct from, say, baby fever or the feeling of one's ovaries screaming, which are these other phrases that kind of get tossed around a little bit in this discourse. And so in Cohen's understanding of the biological clock, biology becomes a substratum, the biological substratum of the experience of running out of time. The clock is presented as antecedent to the world and something to which women are wholly subordinate, and therefore politically and socially neutral state of embodiment that lies outside is unmarked by culture and society, but of course not outside of time. Turn to the next. Thank you. So in what follows, I want to denaturalize this way in which Cohen is describing the experience of running out of time, and I do that by turning to the method of critical phenomenology as well as two conceptual resources within Maurice Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception. Through lines of questioning and compelling description, phenomenology attempts to bring to light what a particular experience is like, and it does so by foregrounding the particular bodily, sensory, spatial, temporal, and intersubjective dimensions of that particular experience. Phenomenology also has the aim of bringing to light the conditions and structures that enable this an experience to be what it is, would enable an experience to have the form that it does and the quality that it does. Critical phenomenology, and which is the method that I'm deploying here, is not just a philosophical project of description, it is a political project, to use Lisa Gunter's term as it's developed in 50 Concepts of Phenomenology. It's a political project in the sense that the descriptive analysis attempts to illuminate the role that historical logics and systems of oppression and relations of power in the world of experience, and it tends to illuminate these structures in the world of experience, but also to critique them and ultimately to change them. So critical phenomenology of the biological clock is one in which I attempt to bring to light what this experience is like, its impact on how a subject encounters the world under its sway, but it also tries to illuminate the particular prejudices and the assumptions and the kind of social constraints that about motherhood that animate the experience of running out of time, and that allow that experience to be what it is. So while discussions of the experience of motherhood, sexuality, and pregnancy and subfertility abound in the work in feminist philosophy and feminist phenomenology, the experience of the biological clock has received relatively little phenomenological attention. And to my knowledge, there's no account of that particular experience through a phenomenological lens. There are a couple paragraphs here and there in different articles. There's one in particular by Kelly Oliver where there's a description of this experience, but it's for the most part it's not sort of frontally analyzed. And yet, I think that an account of the experience of running out of time is important, not only because it adds to the scholarly literature, but because it is an experience that has important, substantial implications for women's view of reproductive time and their life course. So we'll go to the next slide, thank you. Okay, thanks, we can, I think there's 3 other points, and you can just go them all.
Yeah, okay.
Thanks. So the experience of running out of time is an experience concerning lived time. And here I want to focus on 2 senses of time, the passage of time and what Merleau-Ponty calls natural time. Phenomenology has a long-standing interest in the phenomenon of temporality, or what I'll just call here lived time. In the temporality chapter of the Phenomenology of Perception, Merleau-Ponty offers a phenomenologically motivated analysis of the, quote, intimate relationship, end quote, of time and subjectivity by way of a critique of realism and idealism. On Merleau-Ponty's account, realism locates time on the model of a, quote, fluid substance, or, end quote, or in terms of the things themselves. Idealism approaches the being of time by plunging it into, quote, states of consciousness, end quote. While each approach offers seemingly different accounts of time, Merleau-Ponty contends that both are beleaguered by the same erroneous ontological presumption, in which time is rendered into a determinate thing, and therefore as all there for all time, which is a presumption that really flies in the face of the experience of running out of time, precisely because there is no more time, or time is running out. By making time determinate, either by reducing it to a homogeneous medium or fixed schema through which a unified world appears, we lose sight of the senses of time's passage, and by extension, the sense of lived change and aging. The phenomenon of time shows, for Merleau-Ponty, that it is neither in the mind or in the world of things, but it is lived. It is a function of being in the world. Merleau-Ponty argues that the passage of time is an accomplishment, born at the juncture of the body's relationship to the world. Challenging the ontological presumption of time as determinate, the dimensions of time, which are past, the present, and the future, are marked by an openness and coexistence, where each dimension is co-possible of the others. The past is not a bygone period of life, but it rather holds the present open by scattering possibilities that open a world of experience. The present appears according to a prior or past norm. The future is that dimension of the present of what is yet to be in the here and now, and the future of the past is that dimension of time that activates or renews past possibilities. The specific experience of the passage of time in the present is the experience, then, of the emergence and vanishing of new and old meanings in light of a historicized past that opens up new future possibilities. Within the flow of present experience, the passage of time is felt as the ebb and flow of events, of encounters and of worlds, some shallow, others profound, that newly orients the present precisely in light of their passage. The passage of time, then, is not a linear progression of moments along a temporal continuum, so past, present, future, that the body actively unfolds, but rather it's the mutual generation of the past, that takes on a sedimented sense of things, and of the future that takes on a sense of what is not yet, from under the terms of a living present. Merleau-Ponty argues that the dynamics of the passage of time are grounded within, emerge from, and are oriented by an anonymous or generalized experience, what he calls natural time. Natural time, Merleau-Ponty writes, refers to the, quote, time of our bodily functions, which are cyclical, and it is the time of nature with which we coexist, end quote. These are the rhythms of our digestive, sexual cycles, and respiratory systems. Beneath the level of our personal lives, for Merleau-Ponty, is this natural body, that is our own body, but that has its own temporal rhythms. And while the body is an expressive power, its power intimately draws upon and is, quote, entangled, unquote, with the natural rhythm that operates outside the purview of personal volition, while nonetheless founding and carrying all projects. Quote, founding and carrying all projects, it's a line that I take from Thomas. It is precisely because intentional life is absolutely and intimately intertwined with the natural time of the body that the subjects can rise up to meet the world and meet others. And for the purposes of this paper, what is crucial to observe is that that natural time functions within experience precisely by disappearing into the background of experience. But just as much as these natural cycles can prepare and expose us to a world of things through their vanishing, they are equally capable of subordinating personal life or attenuating our bodily powers, as scholars of illness, aging, and disability have demonstrated. So the natural time of existence both renders life, personal life, quote, possible and precarious, end quote. So in its rejection of the determinacy of the natural body, Merleau-Ponty's account of natural time demonstrates that the bodily dimension of existence does not so much drive one's relationship to the biological clock, so much as it opens a perceptual field through which subjects may encounter the world and themselves in it, including the experience of the passage of time. If this were not the case, our sense of the world would just be reducible to a natural given. Well, Cohen's account biologizes the experience of running out of time, as I mentioned earlier. He does identify one important dimension that dovetails with Merleau-Ponty's insights into natural time. We are mostly beholden to the natural rhythms of the body that operate according to their own temporal indices that exceed the jurisdiction of personal choice and agency, but upon which all choice and agency depend. So the next slide, thank you. So, sorry, I forgot to pass the song yet.
Yeah.
Thank you. Great, thank you. So with these basic concepts in mind, I want to turn now to the particular experience of the experience of running out of time. And here I approach it as a temporal and relational disruption in the flow of experience that prompts an existential shift in the stance towards the past, the present, and the future. And I argue that this disruption, whether it's just brief and fleeting or something quite formative, compels subjects to start paying attention to lived time differently through a disruption in the way time is lived and felt. In what follows, I explore the experiential integrity of the experience of running out of time across 4 dimensions. First, that natural time becomes an object of thematic preoccupation, or sometimes been described as sort of an enemy in some of the sort of empirical literature on the biological clock, where there's more of that than in existence than there is in philosophical treatments of the body, the biological clock. Second, as an alteration of the pace of lived time, thanks to the deadline, so we're focusing on racing against the clock or the experience of acceleration. Third, a change in the value of time, looking at the mortality of time or the finitude of time that is revealed through this particular experience. And finally, looking at this experience in terms of a change in the directionality and the order of time. And this is experience in which time becomes something standardized or externalized and put in a particular order or timeline. So I'm going to look at each in turn. So first, you can turn that. Actually, let me go back one. Okay, thanks. So first, under the sway of the biological clock, natural time of the body is brought into tension and into focus through a lens of a problem, disrupting the course of experience. Where previously natural time was lived as the anonymous background of experience, it now has become an object and a potential obstacle to which one's attention is now focused. It needs to be something dealt with rather than just lived through. The obtrusive presencing of natural time opens the subject to a time that needs to be accounted for now the body that once served as a supportive background of experience has become an ambiguous obstacle, around which one's reproductive possibilities depend, but that can place into jeopardy this very possibility. What is unique about the obtrusiveness, to my eyes, of natural time is that it is not an immediate experience of pain, of physical pain or suffering, unlike, for instance, IBS or insomnia. Declining fertility is oddly asymptomatic unless someone is undergoing perimenopause or menopause, in which case time is really running out. And yet it is an experience in which the natural body is encountered as a problem for experience. You can turn to the next slide. Next one. So second, there is a shift in the pace and the intensity of lived time thanks to a fertility deadline. Interviewees in a study by a sociologist named Martina Yoko Diaz on the biopolitics of the biological clock identifies a key aspect of the experience of running out of time among some of her interviewees, and that's the experience of a deadline. Interviewees often identify the deadlines in relation to standardized ages, usually 35 and 40 being very important ages in their mind, where 35 is sort of the start of the deadline, and 40 being the sort of the end. That functioned as marks in time in which subjects really had to act. Deadlines commonly, so I want to look a little bit at like what is a deadline, how it's working within this experience. So deadlines commonly refer to a determinate date and time by which something must be completed, accomplished, or submitted, or something bad will happen. So you have to submit your papers by December 5th, or you'll face the penalty of a grade, you'll face the prospect of a grade penalty. Rebecca Comey, a philosopher at the University of Toronto, argues that what is characteristic of a deadline is that it has a conditional structure. Do this or else something happens. The etymology of the term deadline highlights the conditional nature of the experience of running out of time. The term deadline was coined during the American Civil War to refer to a specific architectural feature of prison of war camps, which you can see right here. It referred to a simple physical or symbolic boundary marking out the edge of the prison. The boundary was made visible by a ditch or by a rope or by a railing, and sometimes it was just a stick or sticks in the ground, and the boundary was enforced by guards. Prisoners were shot if they willfully or accidentally encroached or overstepped the deadline. So crossing the deadline, arriving at the deadline, was met with death, an absolute end. Fertility is highly personal and variable across reproductive years, and as such, it's not easily mappable by standardized deadlines like the ages of 35 or 40. But it does involve a reproductive end. And what is unique about the end of fertility is that it's not set in a determinate date and time. We could actually turn to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, thanks. What is unique about the end of fertility is that it is ambiguously present and absent. The fertility deadline is that it's uniquely ambiguously present and absent in live time. As present, the future is felt as a point after which there will be no more time. There will come a time after which there will be no more time to bring in someone new. As not there, as absent, the fertility deadline is an event that is foreseeable, but that is non-datable. Even as fertility declines with age, the deadline cannot be projected exactly, even by like the best medical doctors. So in this way, the fertility deadline haunts the present as an absent, a certainty of its uncertainty. From a phenomenological perspective, the deadline appears not in the future, but in the past. It appears retroactively or belatedly, only after fertility is a settled matter in either a viable birth and miscarriages or unsuccessful attempts or something else or some mixture of these. Or said differently, the date after reproductive capacities runs out is unknowable prior to its having happened. So in Conley's words, this is why we can never properly ever meet our deadlines. The ambiguity of this closing possibility impacts the experience of the present and of the future. Losing its inexactitude, to use Husserl's term, and edged into place on a temporal chronology, the future loses its openness. To be oriented towards such a future is to live within the terms of a present possibility that is now closing. To experience running out of time in relation to a fertility deadline is to experience lived time as a thing, or as a boundary against which one lives in the present, where once the future was lived without demarcation. To live up against the fertility deadline has the effect of accelerating the pace of lived present, because the present now becomes a moment where one feels an encroachment of what has been forecast, as there's no longer any more time to do anything except to care for this moment now. Indeed, waiting and letting go may be regarded as irresponsible behaviors. The experience of time speeding up entails the experience in which subjects cannot rest. So the ambiguity of the deadline does not make this experience any less meaningful. The fertility deadline contributes to regulating women's experiences and choices of when it is possible and desirable to have children. We'll go to the next slide. Oops. Thank you. I'm wondering if I'm missing a slide. So the next dimension I want to look at is the change in the value of time, or the experience of the mortality of time. What stands out about the experience of running out of time is that if it happens, it is an experience that happens typically between the ages of 27 and 42. These are a little bit arbitrary, but these are generally the time frame. So it does not happen at any given time, but within a limited time frame. However, it would be a mistake to posit that chronological age is the driver of this experience. Evidence for this is twofold. First, not all subjects experience the biological clock ticking, and second, chronological age is an exogenous temporal norm that is not usually mappable onto biological temporal norms. What we find within the experience of running of time then is something more that can be given within the horizons of both chronology and biology. Instead, I suggest that the challenge posed by the biological clock is a challenge posed by being in the world with others. The experience of running out of time may come about through the feeling out of step or out of sync with what is socially expected of us. It may be others who clock us by telling us that our so-called clocks are ticking by way of their comments, their judgments, and their questions of our life choices and what they will have meant without children. Time's mortality and its irreversibility can become emphatically felt through witnessing the hard lessons borne out by our close others of subfertility, pregnancy loss, involuntary childlessness, or the ways in which we might, or our friends and partners might accommodate themselves to the fact that some things were not meant to be. What is possible can never be possible forever. While future possibilities vanish all the time, there are things that die in possibility through which one is made aware of the mortality of time. And I think this is an example of one of those things. This is especially true in those moments when something might not happen for us or might not happen for others. The experience of running out of time imparts an experience of aging, and this particular experience of aging as a threat to experience. Lived time matters because possibilities do not go on forever and may not be recoverable in the way in which we expect, desire, or want. The experience of running out of time is thus an experience of the passage of time as a threat or as an enemy. The growth of the passage of time, the progressive movement from one slot-off world to another, occurs by the giving way of the future in the medium of one's situational bodily commitments. This is a volatile medium and a volatile passage. When the present of what is yet to be starts to close, we're shown our great vulnerability to the passage of time. And so we'll stay here on this slide. And so fourth and finally, there is a change in the directionality and the order of time. Time becomes something standardized. So the awareness of the biological clock ticking can contribute to mathematical calculations through which some women assess how much time they have left before their clocks run out and what kind of planning and anticipating of the future they need to do. So we can, I pulled this fertility calculus off a blog post of a woman who's sort of describing what she needs to do, what she needs to set up in order to manage the next 10 years of her life in which she's single and wants to have children and wants to raise a family and so on. So she comes up with this fertility calculus. She is 31 years of age at that time of the writing, and she's single, and she wants 2 children, so she will need to be at least 30, she will need to have them at least, she will need to have her first at 34, which minus 2 years to be married and to find a person before that child, minus 1.5 years she's to meet and she's to date and marry that person, to vet them for a little bit. And at that point she's 30.5, and so it's already too late. So life has lost its flow, clearly. So when the future becomes something we expect to happen, it assumes a style of futurity I call an expectant future, and I'm playing on this term of expecting. Future determined in what is possible. By an expectant future, I do not mean one pregnant with possibility, so much as a future that already has its place in the order of linear time. Time is lived along a timeline where each moment, each temporal dimension, event, milestone is located along a line in relation to this future deadline, where the present is now lived in terms of a countdown of days, of months, and sometimes of years that arrives from the future rather than lived through. Lived time thus becomes indexed and measured by the demands of the present, and the opened, non-linear temporality of the bodily and social life becomes supplanted by a standardized, linear, and irreversible time. Events within experience are given a particular order. You can turn to the next slide, thank you. So the existential price of wanting more time, or to control time, and there's a bit of an illusion here, the idea that we can control time, is to transform oneself into a clock watcher. And I take this term from a book that was written in 1979, that titles, the first, it was Clock Watcher, and I'm not remembering the second part, but I can get it for you. One puts oneself under a kind of panopticon in which the self turns into both the watched and the watcher. As a clock watcher, women are expected to keep track of time, assess the reproductive risks of waiting too long, anticipate and manage the future outcomes of fertility outcomes, and to approach the flow in times of an important and often quite status quo events along the life course. So finding a partner, having a house, having 2 children, the fairly standardized, conventional life. It's not a criticism or judgment of it, that's just a social expectation. Under the sway of the biological clock, lived time appears to be something that can be managed, negotiated, and controlled and regulated. Scholars such as Jenna Healy, who's a historian of medicine at Queen's University in Canada, has argued that there is a fundamental relationship between the metaphor of the biological clock and assisted reproductive technologies. You saw there was something historically contiguous. The biological clock comes out in '78 as a cultural, as a metaphor, and that's just right at the time that we get IVF. In turning cyclical time into a technological problem, women are inducted into novel disciplinary regimes. The advent of assisted reproductive technologies enables at least the illusion of a certain level of control over fertility that brings with it the emergence of a new kind of management over bodies. Fertility is turned into a technological problem, waiting for a technological solution, and thus fertility is narrowly understood in terms of its treatments. An understanding of the fundamental connection between the biological clock and reproductive technologies can also be made from a phenomenological perspective. The use of assisted reproductive technologies makes self-regulation manageable by making the future more predictable in the actions of the present. Fertility apps assist women in tracking their basal temperature and the consistency of their cervical fluids, as well as any mood changes, changes in sleep pattern or in skin complexion. Home ovulation kits help women monitor their fertility cycles, allowing them to pinpoint almost down to the minute. And sometimes there's these like little happy faces that like pop up right at this exact time where you're highly fertile, where fertility is taken to be high, and allowing women to better control the probabilities of pregnancy. Egg freezing, a transvaginal surgical procedure that involves hyperstimulating the ovaries followed by retrieving and flash freezing viable eggs, functions to suspend or snooze or extend women's fertility. And IVF may give women the possibility of creating embryos and thus more control over the exact timing of pregnancy and family formation. Through the experience of time as something clocked, watched, regulated, and controlled, the relational, contingent, embodied, and cyclical nature of those natural rhythms that I described earlier are in tension with an institutionalized, medicalized time. And then So far I've been providing a phenomenology of the experience of running out of time, and I've done so by foregrounding the spatial, temporal, the affective, and intersubjective dimensions of that experience. But now I want to reverse the order of priority and put some emphasis on the normative assumptions about motherhood that are built into this particular experience. And I argue that the experience of running out of time is structured and animated by a pronatalist conflation about motherhood that serves to reinforce normative assumptions about reproduction, family formation, gender, the life course, and even the good life. And there are 3 sort of dimensions to this, 3 conflations in this experience. The first is that motherhood is good, and to be deprived of children is something bad. The second is that nature, or the biological clock, determines motherhood, and that is something both at a genetic and gestational level. So you have a genetic connection with the child and a gestational connection is you're carrying your children. And that the timing of motherhood is important, so that you can't be too old and you can't be too young. If you're too old, the idea is that you end up putting the child at risk for certain genetic conditions, and also putting the mother's health at risk as well. And if you're too young, sort of thinking of teen pregnancies here, you're too irresponsible and too immature to be able to take care of a child. So the biological clock has implicit this idea of when is a good time to be a mother. The pronatalist conflation, in which a reproductive imperative conflates motherhood and womanhood and naturalizes childbearing, flattens the experience of motherhood and does not reflect the perspectives of many families, it does not reflect the perspectives of parents or the realities of many families. By emphasizing that it is female reproductive systems that determine women's capacity to have children, motherhood and reproduction are conflated and exclude other viable possibilities and models for childbearing and family formation, such as adoption, platonic co-parenting, and other alternative pathways. In putting the focus on the biological imperative and female reproductive capacities, moreover, the pronatalist conflation covers over the ways in which social structures and contexts within which women are making reproductive choices are part of shaping this experience, such as a lack of affordable health care, limited maternity leave, but also that the work of motherhood is generally undervalued. Positing the biological clock as the basis of motherhood and family formation that severely limits our understanding of this complex phenomenon. And so to conclude, I've been arguing that the experience of running out of time is characterized by a closing possibility in the living present whose impact goes beyond the present. When the future becomes something expected, the present becomes beset by a deadline against which one lives. Being haunted by a future deadline is a form of passivity, and this is what supplies the present with its sense of felt urgency. At the same time, this passivity to the future actively works against the future to forestall its inevitable unfolding. A critical phenomenology of the biological clock is both an invitation to bring to light a prenatal experience that lies outside the margins of dominant experiences of motherhood, sexuality, and pregnancy as they've been taken up in the secondary literature, and to shift the focus of the analysis from personal experiences of running out of time in light of an impending deadline to social prejudices and structures that enable and constrain women's choices. Rather than take the experience of running out of time as a natural given or assume it's taken for granted meaning, it situates the experience in intersubjective and social contexts. In this account, the metaphor of the biological clock is not simply a rather poor representation of maternity and time. It is lived experience that importantly affects women's behaviors, not only their views and experiences of fertility and the management of the burden of the risks of age and aging, but also their practices of family formation, career development, education, and the uses of assisted reproductive technologies. Thanks so much.
We have time for questions.
Well, thank you for that paper. That was really wonderful, and it just brought up so many different ideas listening to it. And one thing I was struck by, I focus on ancient philosophy in my own classes, but there's this really interesting phenomenology of aging in Aristotle's Rhetoric, where he's talking about, and he analyzes it in terms of times of life, but so the experience of the world for people in their youth is very different from the experience of the world in old age or in prime of life, and he's analyzing all this. And but what struck me as an interesting connection, I mean, he's not doing the critical phenomenology piece that you're talking about, but the need, the effort to control our biology, to force it to answer to what is most advantageous and all that he actually associates with old age, that there's a peculiar kind of psychology, and he describes it in terms of a shrinking of perspectives and the need to control, which is absent in the youth, and it is at least forestalled in the prime of life. So it's as though, and I want to think about this more, but it's almost as though what you're describing is a kind of shrinking of temporality for younger people in terms of concepts or needs that are not yet on the horizon. Naturally, Aristotle would say, though, we can critique his naturalism there. I don't know if this is connecting with the argument you're making, but it was really interesting to me in terms of this very different project going on in Aristotle.
Yeah, right, so thinking of, like, when we normally think of aging or experiences of aging, we attribute them to later life, and we could give ages to that. It could be like 40 plus or 55 plus, or we could say like old age belongs to people who are 80 plus. It doesn't matter, we've said that segment of life is when you start to experience aging. And I think what I think the experience of the biological clock does is it complicates that temporality. It shows that that there's one particular experience of aging that can show up in earlier than 40 years, like much later in life.
Yeah.
I'm always hesitant, I use in the dissertation I work on old age in particular, and I always and I work with the sort of philosophical texts, but also I think it's important to question the kind of characterizations of later life in philosophy, including some work of Simone de Beauvoir's and Jean Henry's, for some of the ways in which they can sort of reduce experience, can have fairly reductive and not realistic experiences, just very uncomplicated experiences of old age or later life or the sort of phenomenon of age. And so I'd also want to be careful of that, like when we're using these philosophers to not just take what they say as reflective of the embodied experience. So my attempt, even in this paper, but maybe not, certainly in the dissertation, is to keep open what it means to age and the meanings of aging, and to really see that the experience of aging and later life admits of so many different experiences, one of which, an important one of which, includes losses, includes some shrinkage. But there are young people who can be very old. And Spinoza talks about this in the Ethics. He talks about like young people who have sort of very rigid and their thinking are very closed-minded. They sort of have the sort of old. He talks about older adults who also are very childish. He talks about they play the clown. He says so you can, that part of what I'm doing in this paper and as well as in the dissertation is trying to disrupt how we know that sort of ordering of time in stages, and to see that what we normally think what we normally think belongs to an experience just at one time, we can actually find it in other times of life, including in old age. There are certain different styles of youth potentially there. But yeah, thanks so much for the question and the reminder that we're forward with this.
So let me preface this by saying that I too have seen the meme which says, guy talks for 2.5 minutes and yet no hint of a question. So but I want to appeal to maybe some other of your work, because as you were going through all of the parts of the argument about the deadline and haunting the present as a future that's both there and not there, I think this, and then turning yourself into a watched and the watcher, I think this can be generalized in our current culture beyond this case, because Peter Attia, who is a medical doctor, his book Outlived has been on the New York Times bestseller list for the past 10 weeks or something. And he's a longevity doctor, and many of his patients are in their 20s and 30s, but everything is about health span and the deadline past which you're gonna fall apart and be, and so, but this turns people into watchers and also the watched, because now people are wearing glucose monitors, they're checking their VO max all the time, they're checking their flexibility, their stability, and all of the components seem to be reiterated in this new sort of emerging context that might also need a phenomenological critique. So I don't, that's not a question, I recognize that. But I wondered, had you thought about that, and also about the fact that, another parallel with your analysis is that this phenomenon of running out of time isn't experienced by everyone. So whereas there are 30-year-olds who are like, oh, I don't know about my inflammation levels, and I don't know about my glucose levels and all of that, there are other people, like this cousin that I had in Tennessee, which she was 90-something years old, and she was driving around all the time, Meals on Wheels, to take the food to the old folks, because who were all younger than her, but just, it's the same thing, right? I mean, there are parallels in that case now among all age groups, and both, so it's not just a woman centered phenomenon, but in this case now with this focus on longevity and this super awareness of what you do right now, you have to count back. In fact, Peter Attia actually says that if you want to be able to lift a suitcase into the overhead bin now, then you better be lifting this much. When you're 90, you better be lifting this much now.
Right.
If you want to be able to play on the floor with a grandchild when you're 85, then you be able to get off the floor with right now. And so it's got the same urgency, the same kind of, and I don't know if you see a relation that, I think it can be generalized, that's a comment, but the question is, do you see a relation in the sort of evolution of culture that would account for the fact that this biological clock now has been sort of universalized to everybody?
Yeah, that's great. I had not thought of that. And I've noted this book, Outlive. Okay. I think that there are structures of this experience that overlap with other experiences. So I don't think that the particular experience of running out of time is exclusive of experiences of health span, and there's so in that sense there's sort of there's overlap. There's not going to be these clear sort of lines between this particular experience and the experience of needing to lifting things and that kind of thing. I think that one of the things that's unique about, I think, this experience of running time is this sort of gendered aspect to it, and the cultural expectations that are placed on women and the sort of social pressures that are placed on maybe, and it's not just women. I am using that in this paper, and maybe it's a little messy, that I should be a little more clear in what the who of this paper, but the kind of pressures that are put on individuals to have maybe not just children, but also to have certain events in their life in order, and there's certain sense of accomplishment or success in being a healthy older adult, for instance, and aging well or aging successfully. In being a person that has it all together, which is they have their house and their children, and that being something that's rewarded in our culture. And so when you're not in line with those social expectations, there's a sense of maybe not, or being feeling behind, or not feeling like you're in step with what other people are doing. And I think that really is the central to this project. I really focused heavily on natural time because that's where I am in my thinking of this paper, but an over-focus on natural time kind of, we could risk rubbing out the importance of cultural time and historical time as well, which I think is what your question to be getting at.
Yeah, I was interested in natural time too, because natural time is like the cyclical kind of time that we all live in, because we evolved in a planet that goes around the sun and goes around in circles too, I think, but or does something like that. But it results, I don't know.
So they say.
But, I mean, but there are lots and lots of those natural cycles, like blinking cycles and sleep cycles and digestive cycles. And so are there, I mean, clearly in this case, there are very particular ones, cycles that are influencing the behavior and the experience of people. But, or, I don't know Merleau-Ponty well enough on this topic to even ask the question, but the question is, how many different kinds of cycles are you presupposing in the idea of natural cycles as a background against which everything else happens?
Yeah, I really am drawing heavily on Merleau-Ponty here. He doesn't even really list the cycles, so it's a little bit of suggestive work on my part. For him, the important part of natural time is that it's sort of this generalized part of our existence that is resumed, is taken up by the subject and articulated in a particular way. So our habit, for him, it connects it to habit, and the habit body draws upon the fact that the body and expresses and stylizes the body in a particular way. So we all know how to walk, but we all walk in this sort of stylized, particularized way that reflects this natural history of our bodies, but also our personal histories, how we were taught to walk, all sorts of things that come into play there. So for Merleau-Ponty, it's, in one way, the natural time of the body holds all of history in it. To time immemorial, because we are part of nature. We're not just inserted in nature, we're sort of expressions of nature. But how many, which would include the spinning suns and moons and all of that, and so I'm not sure if that answers the kind of the question.
Yeah, I think that my question was just ill conceived, because I when I heard natural time and I heard cyclical and whatever, and I was thinking there are all these cycles that are affecting everything, but you really just meant the concept in a much more generalized, overarching sort of the background time that we find ourselves in and experience.
That we draw on and that we're dependent upon.
And then that becomes distorted.
And then, sorry?
And then that becomes distorted.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that becomes like externalized and managed, and yeah, so it's these natural times, these cyclical times of the body, when they become a problem for experience, become externalized and sort of ordered in time. So the relationship to time is distorted or is changed.
Yeah, that seems really good. Thank you.
Yeah,
that's
thanks
great.
for the question.
I was thinking similarly the way that you parsed out time earlier, and it occurs to me that the clock itself is already a pretty poor expression of time for anyone. So it's already sort of a mutilation of the way we experience time, because of course time is thick. It has resistance, it has friction, especially in the experience of its passage. And that the future is not seen as a kind of point on a line. That's a spatial representation of time that's not accurate. So I thought, even to represent experience via the metaphor of a clock, that's already a distortion. But what I like about the critical phenomenology is that on top of that, there's the further distortion that's made in this kind of pronatalist ideology, where so anyone would experience time, let's say, in a deficient mode by having it represented as a clock. So that compounded with the fact that a person's body is actually being regulated in how it can experience its own endurance, its own duration. And so I like towards the end of your talk, I was sort of on the edge of my seat to hear what the possibility of this experience could be outside of this ideological representation of time. But for me, it's almost maybe just sufficient to leave it as a possibility. To say that for so long, motherhood and this biological has been represented as a biological clock. For so long, that's cast it in these terms, that all the other kinds of possibilities of this experience have become marginal, ignored. So even the fact that there's a possible way of thinking about motherhood, not according to the clock model, which is disruptive of the experience of time anyway, that political, ideological component to it is really interesting to me.
Yeah, no, that's great. and it's certainly like a limit in the presentation. I didn't get into these alternative ways of relating to it's a positive thing. I'm thinking, like, the first thought that came to mind was some work done out of Yale, an anthropologist at Yale University who does ethnographic work with African American elite women, and she has a book on the biological clock, but from the perspective of these black women in Atlanta and how they've managed it. And it's a very different narrative than the narrative that I produced here. In part because their family, from what I remember, the parts because their family structures are very different than the kind of composite women, the kind of white professional who might be single and that kind of thing. So even then, there's this experience of being under the sway of the biological clock, but it's an experience that is not an experience of running out of time. It's something else. And then I'll have to look into this a little bit more, but I know there is like work in feminist philosophy that looks at the experiences of birth and pregnancy that are not under a clock or not medicalized, and the ways in which that the body, the tensions that appear within experience when the bodies are put in relation to institutionalized time or medicalized time. And that would be like another place to, but you're right, I think the biological clock, we'd have to kind of lose that metaphor if we wanted to get access to what those experiences might be like. Yeah, that's great, thank you.
Although if a student has a question, I want to make sure there's room. Really love the turn to the pronatalism. As this, the way you're thinking through the intersubjective and the social and political. And I love the way you put about the who of the paper, and I think pronatalism has a lot to say about the who and the relationship to eugenics. And in this study you were just mentioning out of Yale, sounds like a really it does not surprise, right, that there would be these different narratives out of that. And I was thinking about like motherhood's a really funny term, and it's really interesting about like how motherhood's being turned just into pregnancy. Right? Like it's like about this one, I mean, you talked about it, the gestational and the genetic, and it's like the gestational, right? To be motherhood is now about gestating, right? And no wonder, because pronatalism's really interested in who's going to gestate and who won't. And all of this concern that like white women won't produce their 4 children for the state, right? In the US, this is like sort of the dominant thing through the mid-century when eugenics is still having its heyday, right? It's like white women in the middle class having 4 children. So I like the who of the pronatalist, because it's like starts to get at who's getting disciplined to gestate, and who's getting disciplined not to. And right, and is under pressure to have long-term contraception, or to be sterilized, or to don't worry so much about your biological clock, or your like biological clock is wild, right? Is a place of savagery that's gonna introduce the end of the nation. So I think this point is so important to not only like how motherhood's being conceived, like who's a proper mother and what their work is and what their reproductive labor should be. And that it's somehow it's just wild, right? That just pregnancy would be the work of motherhood. But then like who shouldn't feel any pressure at all, right? To use this capacity or to reproduce under these terms of pronatalism, because it's always linked to nation, and it's always linked to what the proper nation is and what the nation should look like, and its strongest sort of eugenic expression. So I think this is so rich, and like I think it relates to clock time and all these things, but I just think that pronatalist turn is so crucial. Like you're gonna get so many different narratives depending on, are you being encouraged by the state or are you being discouraged by the state to reproduce? That's like my Foucauldian cards on this, but I think you have disciplinary time in there to turn to, like all this individuation and management through clock time.
Yeah, Foucault kind of haunts this, but not quite. I don't go right into the thick of it. I think it's a fantastic question, so thank you for bringing it up. I was talking to Barong yesterday about this. I did have a fourth dimension, which is that motherhood is white, and
Yeah.
that's the
That seems,
yeah. But I didn't feel quite that I had done enough to articulate it. But I think that sort of speaks to this point that you're making, that it's not just a question of being too young or too old and this biological presumption at the heart of motherhood, and that it's good to be a mother, but that there's a relationship between pronatalism and race and history that is at play, and who gets to be a mother, and in very practical ways, like who even has access to these assisted reproductive technologies, which I mentioned are in the tens of thousands of dollars, are going to be a certain kind of person, and for the most part, it's going to be sort of white, elite, professional women who can afford these technologies, and so there is a sort of these IVF and egg freezing kind of are technologies that work to secure a certain kind of future, not only for the mother, but for kind of for the nation as well. And it's part of this story of the biological clock that has not also yet, it's not been explored.
and I would just say also surrogacy, right? And that surrogates can be anywhere and whomever, and they can be very young, right?
Right.
So long as they are surrogates to the correct people for the project of nation building, right? Like, I think it's a really interesting place where biological time and nation building meet in actual bodies, right? Yeah. So it's just great. I think this turn to prenatalism is just like so key. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, I'm just noting all this down.
Can I make a comment to supplement that? I have to preface it by saying the subtitle of my dissertation was a phenomenological critique of naturalism, so
Okay.
I love the way you're doing this.
Great.
But you probably know this now, but there are some rooms you walk into and you say that critical phenomenology, and you're not going to get quite the welcome you get in other rooms. But what I thought of right away when I saw the announcement for your talk was last spring, I was teaching a course that has to do with race and gender, and Tucker Carlson had just repeated the replacement theory on television. And I went into class
the
and
Fox News
Say it again?
person.
Yeah.
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 Okay.
So I went into class thinking, okay, how are we going to cover this in class? I've got to say something about how, wow, we live in a culture now where we're being told white women need to make more white babies for the nation, for the nation to. So this white supremacy isn't hiding; it's actually
Right.
being broadcasted now. It's not subtle; it's in our faces.
Right.
Well, right. So that happened to me, and I saw the announcement. I thought, oh gosh, I wonder if we're gonna. And then you just said there's a fourth element. I thought, oh, that's where it was. It was on the other part of this paper. But the part that intrigues me is by the end when you were talking about how phenomenology has the ability to describe sort of the social context, or I think one of you used the word horizon in the Husserlian sense. That if we're not talking about individuals making individual decisions, and if phenomenology can give us a view into what constitutes one's subjective relation to the world, and what constitutes that is culture, social pressure, history, these other things,
Right.
then maybe we can bring white supremacy into this discussion and say, the biological clock now has a very particular white supremacist element to it from the way you're analyzing it. So I love the idea of the who as well. So we're not just talking about what we mean by women, but we're also talking about the political problem of who should be reproducing and for what ends, what purpose. I think the white supremacy in that language, current cultural language, is so thick and so disgusting, yet it's hard to analyze it because you need a tool like that sort of critical phenomenology, because otherwise we just slide back into this kind of liberalist assumption that it's individuals with money who can do that, right?
Right.
That's true, but what constitutes the individual? I love the way phenomenology gives us a way to describe that differently than the basic philosophical assumptions of other methods do. So.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, even just to build off what you're saying, just sort of the importance of the context in which we're embedded in, that looking at the context and looking at it in terms of sort of social positioning, things like race and gender, taking an sort of intersectional approach to the biological clock. Allows us to even understand like the notion of choice, which is also at the heart of this experience. Like the biological clock is an experience that one can have only because you have a choice between these two competing futures. If you have a choice over your own body, your autonomy over your body, and that's not something that is an intellect. Everyone has choices, and that's not just because that's not a personal or an individual problem. It's not a problem on the side of the individual. There's a problem on the side of a context or social context that constrain possibilities for subjects in different ways depending on who, social positioning and sensibilities.
Well, and I also think it'd be interesting to read like race theory that gets into this question of now the pressure on young white women to make more white babies, or for surrogates to gestate white babies.
Yeah.
I haven't read a lot of contemporary phenomenology that gets into race in that way. I think your whole subject about this biological clock ideology or metaphor could really lead to some interesting race work in philosophy about this replacement theory, white supremacy stuff that is just so fun to study. So, what?
Never dies.
Yeah, excellent.
Well, neither does the racism and the ageism and the classism that's wrapped up in the presumption of everything in all of this Bulletproof Coffee and Dave Asprey and Outlive and all of that, because you will not get a job if you look old. And if you try, it's true. I mean, you go into...
If you don't get in the right preschool, you're just...
Yeah, exactly,
How
right?
do people live?
That's right. I mean, we start them off,
Amazing.
man, because
Yeah.
if you're, if you're 65 and your company closes and you try to go get work, that you won't. And if you are Hollywood people that are like all chopped up so that you look like you're 12, then fine, you can still have jobs. But if you don't do that stuff, then you won't have jobs and any place. So in all of those cases, the critique is still we're still crying out for the critique of the classism and yeah. And I think the experience is completely different if you're not rich enough to be involved in any of that. If you're in a culture in which, I don't know, you actually appreciate age, where it's not American, and if you're over 40, you're dead. We're all dead. So. But I mean, that is true, right? Because that would be, I was thinking about the Atlanta women that you were talking about, and that whole experience would be very different. I think that the whole experience would be quite different, and cultures that appreciate. I always think about Sophia Loren and the Italians and having this like experience and age and this beautiful, and like totally different thing, right, than in American film industry or whatever it is. Certainly in tech industries, if you're over 34.
Yeah, I think in general, age is such a new phenomenon in phenomenology that it's so ripe for interrogation, and it's also so naturalized, which covers over these sort of contexts, this white supremacy, the way this whole state plays social expectation, like the expectations of who we should be and how we should become, at what time, when, and where. There is, I'm thinking, and that you really, it's hard to, when you sort of push on when you interrogate that, the phenomenon, really push on its limits, it's hard to separate it, if at all, from questions of like race and gender. I have another project that's looking at race, the intertwining of race and ageism in the experience of African American children. And there's a study came out a couple years ago on the adultification effect, or the adultification bias of children being like 14 and under. And the bias is that African American children are treated as older than they in fact are, and that has real material implications for their lives. They're penalized in different ways relative to white children, and And so the project kind of looks at that intertwining, how ageism, which usually we think of ageism as something that is just projected onto older bodies, but it could also apply to older bodies as well. Looking at the intertwining of ageism and racism, and how racism has, and just sort of that relationship, and that you really can't think of that phenomenon without an investigation of both age and race and racism.
It'd be a great way to look at white privilege too, I think, as like a sociological analysis,
Right.
where kids from both class privilege and race privilege get to have this extended adolescence, but if you're young and you're not white, then you're expected to know better and you shouldn't have committed these crimes, and therefore
Right.
we're treating you as an adult. in
Yeah,
the penal
presumption of
system.
innocence that that white children have, and that gives them all sorts of latitude to make mistakes, to learn, to grow, to just be,
Mhm.
treated in accordance with their developmental capacities, and that's not this report.
I'm gonna steal that, by the way.
Yeah.
Because every time we do this class and we get to the subject of white privilege, I'd love to find examples to lay this out. That's a perfect example to use.
It hasn't been written about philosophically, but there is some work on that. in
I'll cite
sociology.
you on
Okay.
I do have a question, actually. So, I'm a political science major, and we were like, actually, in my last class, just talking about like the Dobbs decision and all of that. And so, I guess what I've been thinking about while we're all talking is that like your right there, the timing of motherhood, the not too young and not too old situation, and you citing like the year of 1978 specifically, and like that era of like this last 50 years about like how that perception, what you're talking about, has permeated this past era. And like in, a long time ago, it's like, oh, you're 13 and having a baby, like that's great, like we love that, or whatever. Whenever you're ripe, like that was the standard of motherhood, was like that was okay. And now that like there is more state control in just the autonomy of bodies, and a sort of like regressive path of our state specifically weaponizing like their position against people and their bodies and their decisions, like do you think that like what you're talking about, like this awareness, you said like you wanted, the goal of this is to like bring more awareness to the social and political issues that affect this, like do you think that that could be changing, like that this idea that was in that Washington Post article was just like for a certain period of time, and now that we're in like going into a new period of time, that perception is going to change about like the timing is right, and like all, like pretty much all of what you're talking about. Do you think so?
Yeah, I think that's right. That sounds right to me, that the kind of over time, what's considered culture, like the, because what I take your question to be is that the age at which, or the time frame in which it's socially appropriate to have children shifts, and maybe it shifts in relation to legal norms, and certainly in relation to technologies. I think, now I think the biological clock is an experience of running out of time, but it's also this experience that kind of is slowly just becoming about late motherhood. It's just about, 37 and 37 to 42. That's really what I think, and it's deeply connected to assisted reproductive technologies.
Right.
And there's all sorts of questions there about whether it's even, that there are questions about the appropriateness of having children at 42,
Right.
when there's all sorts of risks that are potentially involved in having a child at that age, risks to mother and to the child. And how we really almost shame teenage moms for having children too young, because they're not prepared to give, it's a different kind of risk, they're not prepared to give their children the best possible life because they're just so young themselves.
Right.
So I think, I think that the background of experience, the cultural background of experience, is as it changes, it also changes expectations of what's appropriate, or changes understandings of what's appropriate at an appropriate time of life to embark on a project like this, a project of motherhood. I'm hoping I'm getting the.
Yeah,
Your
yeah,
question,
yeah, I don't
right?
know, I'm just like thinking about what everybody's been saying and like about, like just how really, I think it's kind of, I don't know, I just feel like it's like, kind of like that rhetoric of the, like as a young woman myself, you know, like I just feel like the people in my age group are like, they're not as like upset about this like idea of the clock running out, you know, like a lot of people our age is like they don't want to have children at all, like they're just because of whatever climate change or our society falling down, but yeah, like a lot of reasons, you know, but they're just like I don't want to have kids and they don't feel that pressure and they, like I mean they may, you know, have like family members or whatever other people in their social circle who make those judgments, but I mean, yeah, I don't know. I have one sister who is pregnant right now and she's 27, and then I have another sister who's 30 and doesn't want to have kids at all, and it's like, you know, I don't know. I just think that like I feel like in this particular time it's changing, and that maybe like yeah, that like the state intervention of like our decisions about what we want to do is more like really impactful in that, and like kind of maybe in like the adverse way, like now, you know, we don't have the federal right to abortion, so it's like a lot of women are like, yeah, well, I would never want to have kids anyways, and I'm not even gonna try, and like contraception's always gonna happen for me, and you know, until menopause or, you know, so I don't know.
Yeah, no, I see your point here. I think it's excellent, like sort of, looking at these legal and climate horizons is impacting this possibility even of a deadline relating to the biological clock. So what I think you could be saying is that
Yeah.
climate deadlines, that there is this sense of an impending future that puts us at risk at an existential level that may have the effect of rubbing out like this question of the biological clock, because people, you know, we're just not concerned with the biological clock anymore because there's other things that are happening in the world that are affecting your decisions around reproduction. So situating it within, I hadn't thought about that at all, but the sort of broader, especially the climate context and the effects it has on the biological clock or the experience of having children. Certainly I've heard of people not wanting to have children because of it, which makes sense.
Well, and I also wanted just to say, like, I think that what you're doing is really amazing and important, and I think that I wouldn't have thought of any of those things without hearing you, so I'm not saying, like, it's not relevant, like, it is relevant now, but just, like, in the future generations, you know, we'll see.
Yeah, excellent, thank you.
I think to add on to what you said too, even if this specific instance of a pressure of time of the biological clock might be changing for younger people such as us, there's still some kind of pressure of time and aging felt. Like my mind specifically goes to like the realm of beauty and like you said, health, specifically like with skincare, there's such this preoccupation with trying to keep your skin looking healthy and trying to use technology as like a proactive measure to keep off this deadline and this kind of scary idea of something that will, you know, is bad and will destroy your life when it's just aging. But I think
Too many birthdays, it'll tear you up.
Yeah. And I think even if this specific deadline with motherhood might change somewhat in the future, there's still this growing sense of other deadlines and still this kind of technological element of we can use technology to somehow control our own time and change our own time and prevent it.
Yeah, I mean, your question, your comment, which is excellent, really points to just how deep ageism is and how normalized it is. The idea that at 20, this is a worry, and also just the idea that aging is something to ward off, or an experience you might not want to have, or that there's shame in having wrinkles or having gray hair or in the body changing in the way that it does is just such a sort of problematic way of thinking of this process that we have. This really is a privileged process to undergo, and to, you definitely see it in the beauty industry, and this idea that it's bad to age, and that, you know, a little self-blame, like if you're aging and you have wrinkles, it's because maybe you didn't use the right technology or something, right, and that,
Around here, it's like you didn't use sunscreen.
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Buy the right
there's a
Shame on
lot
you,
of,
yeah.
there's a lot of like shaming and blaming that is connected to
Yeah.
age and that process.
So I think to add on even where the preoccupation with age overflows in so many different aspects of our life. It overflows into, you know, motherhood and how we should plan our life. It overflows into our health and like what we should eat. It goes into our fashion of like what we should wear to look young, to keep up with the trends, of like even maybe how we should think and the things we should focus on and study on. There's just such a preoccupation in age in every little aspect of our life.
Right. Yeah, and this like striving for this ideal and mythical body that doesn't change, or that's not open and exposed to the world, and that being what allows us to have a world in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
That was great, thank you.
I was just gonna say something quickly, before we wrap up, I think we're almost time. So I wanna situate your, project, which is really great, it's really excited about this, in, maybe bigger narrative of like tensions between different temporalities.
Mhm.
So, the way in which futurity itself is conceived through children and reproduction, right? Like, so I'm thinking of queer critique of like the No Future, the Lee Edelman's work, right? Like, or critique of heteronormative idea of time. So the futurity always is like reproduction. And Elizabeth Freeman's work on chrononormativity, like what should happen at what stages of one's life, right? Also a queer critique of heteronormative conception of time, and this narrative of futurity through reproduction and children, how that was utilized to, like, thinking of Sarah's comment again, like the biopolitics of reproduction, where the best way women can contribute to the future is reproduction, right? And for the nation, looking at like early sort of idea of American womanhood in like 1890s, and how like eugenics and euthenics, right? Like how you manage your household is, and how you like how you keep the racial purity, like through reproduction, like all this discourse around it actually reduces womanhood also to motherhood, right? Like, that's the best. Yeah, you're most useful for the nation if you reproduce, right? So there's that, I guess, right? Like that sort of different forms pop up in different faces, right? And also, so I think that Perceiva's women, like article Women's Time, talks about how masculine time is linear and progressional and historical time, whereas women's time typically is described as cyclical, right, and natural time, close to natural time. So, so I think this biological clock can be situated in that sort of tension where women's time has to join this linear progressional time, right? Like, so something has to happen and like contribute to the progression of nation, right? Like, and of course, like continuing like racial purity, right? In all sorts of areas, like prevent like any sort of possibility of disability, right? After a certain age, right? Like, so it shows up in every sorts of way of normalizing and like the norms around reproduction, it seems, right? So just wanted to put it in a sort of bigger picture in there.
Yeah, I mean, the tension in the work is to try to both honor an experience, because it's given short shrift and mostly just sort of like not taking seriously, but also to show the ways in which this experience also reproduces really like in an insidious ways harmful norms that that would want critiquing to challenge and to ultimately change. The question around using like this queer critique of futurity and childhood, I've sort of looked into it a little bit, and I guess my only concern is that there is like sort of no mother or no labor that brings in this child, right? So there's sort of an erasure of the procreative work that goes into childhood in general, like it's just something for me to work through a little bit. But I see the point is like linking up this future to a certain heteronormative idea.
Such a like limited understanding of future through like
Right.
continuing generations.
There's, you know, I'll just say one other thing, one of the things that the assisted reproductive technologies has done is allows for queer families and to do it in a way, and do it in ways that are really liberatory for queer people. And so there's this other side to the assisted reproductive technologies that even though they produce a certain kind of future, they also liberate futures for other groups that if they have the means, have access and the means and the desire to have this heteronormative future, which has been denied to them for queer people, that they have that's something that's there too. But yeah, that's great. Thank you, Ron.
Thank you everyone for being here and for the discussion. And please join me in thanking our speaker.
Thank you.